the longer and slower events get, the more athletes seem to thrive on a combination of hypotonic drinks and solid foods. As events sort of get towards the shorter and faster end, but are still maybe going on for several hours, some athletes at least will tend to gravitate more towards, say, hypertonic drinks and gels and get on okay with that.
That Triathlon Show 191. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode I interview Andy Blow, founder of Precision Hydration, and this is the long-awaited hydration Q&A that I've been asking for questions for quite a few weeks, and Precision Hydration have also sent out a call to action for questions. And we did both get in a lot of questions, which we are very grateful for. They were great questions, and we did manage actually to pack in all of the questions that we got in the episode and answer all of them. So hopefully, if you did send in a question, you find the answer useful and it will help you in your training and racing. Just a very brief introduction of Andy in case you are not familiar with him. He is, as I said, the founder of Precision Hydration and also a former elite triathlete. He now races quite a bit of swim run events when time permits, and he has been on the podcast a few times before. Episodes 49 was on hydration, Q&A number 27 was on cramping, and training for swim run was in episode number 126. Those will all be linked to in the show notes. Now, big thanks to our sponsors, and of course one of them is Precision Hydration, and you can find them on precisionhydration.com. And honestly, just listen through to this episode and you'll hear more about what they're about and what they do, how they help athletes perform with electrolytes and hydration products and advice as well. So you can use the promo code ThatTriathlonShow as usual to get your first box or tube for free. But also, as Andy will mention in the episode, we have a special discount valid for 1 month from the date of this show being released. That is That Triathlon Show 20, so That Triathlon Show 20, to get 20% off your entire order. So this is a good time to make a larger order of Precision Hydration product. Thank you also to Roka, that are the world leaders in wetsuits, tri-suits, and high-performance eyewear. An example of the type of innovation that you'll find in their products and in their eyewear, and in this particular case that I want to talk about, goggles in particular, is the angling of their lenses on the R1 swim goggles. While traditional goggle lenses look straight down, that doesn't really help you see in the direction that you're actually moving. But the R1 lens actually has an 11-degree angle to the lens that helps you see forward and get a larger peripheral vision. So it means that you don't have to lift your head as much when sighting, and it also means that you can see feet and see bubbles out of that peripheral vision more easily when following feet. So that is a great advantage. I really love the R1 goggles for open water swimming and racing, in particular for those reasons. So you can get 20% off the R1 goggles and actually your entire order when you do your shopping of Roka products on roka.com. All right, let's get into the Q&A with Andy Blow. Welcome back to the show, Andy.
Yeah, good to be back, Michael. How are you?
I'm pretty good. A bit tired from traveling back from a race, but excited to get into some really good hydration questions that we've received both on my end from the listeners, and you've sent it out to your newsletter as well, I think, and have a lot of questions that you generated. So let's just crack on with this Q&A. The first question is from Kate in New York, who I'm going to shorten some of these questions a little bit, but basically she asks about how to rehydrate when you're doing evening workouts to prevent headaches and calf cramps when sleeping. At the same time, you don't want to go up 2 to 3 times per night to pee. And her second part is how to best preload for races. Do you want to cover the first part first, like rehydrating from evening workouts, but not getting up too much to pee during the night?
Yeah, definitely. That's quite a common question with people who have to train late. And I think although she's asked about rehydration, part of the strategy there, if you're training late in the evening, is to make sure you go into that session well hydrated. So making sure that you've had a decent drink, preferably something with some electrolytes in it, in the couple of hours before the session. That will then obviously reduce the amount that you've got to drink during and afterwards, which then has a knock-on effect to stopping you get up during the night. But on rehydration specifically, the science is actually, it's one of the few areas in hydration where the science is really, really clear. And basically, the more sodium you put in a drink for rehydration purposes, the better your body tends to hold on to it and retains it. So really, we'd advise someone like that to have maybe a smaller volume of a higher strength electrolyte drink, something above 1,000 to 1,500 milligrams per litre of sodium, in order to make sure that whatever they're drinking, they're holding on to and not getting up in the night to wee out.
And how much do you think that they would like to rehydrate? Let's say that it's a 1 hour, pretty hard indoor bike trainer workout. What would be a good amount if you go into it hydrated and you have maybe 750 mils of fluid during the workout? How much do you need to rehydrate after the workout?
As with all these things, it's always hard to give a generic recommendation where things are highly individual. I would say the range, though, is going to be between sort of 300 or 400 milliliters if someone's a light sweater, up to getting close to 1 liter if they're a heavy sweater. But I would say, middle ground, 500-600 milliliters, something like that for most people if they've worked out pretty hard, if it's a sweaty workout. If the body cannot really, most people struggle to absorb much more than about a litre per hour. So assuming you're kind of finishing the workout, having some food, having a drink and going to bed, then it's going to be largely unproductive to drink much more than a litre in most cases, because you are going to end up peeing that out anyway.
Makes sense. And the second part of the question, Kate writes that I had toe cramps despite having a scratch drink in my water bottle in a recent half marathon. It was not terribly hot, but it was humid. In terms of triathlon, she races sprint triathlons, and she has often felt dehydrated on the run, but haven't had any cramping issues. She writes that she is a heavy sweater, with sweat usually burning her eyes on the bike and run. So that part is for preloading for racing, I guess. How would you advise her to approach that?
Yeah, that's a very common question, is how to, because people realise that it's a good idea to start an event or a hard training session hydrated, and the typical way that I guess most people initially go around that is just upping the amount of water or upping the amount of sports drink that they drink in the build up. And we've done a pretty comprehensive blog on that on our website, which I'll link you to, called How to Start Hydrated. But really what it comes down to is a bit like the rehydration thing. For prehydration, having extra sodium in the drink, so something that's at least 1,000 or 1,500 milligrams of sodium per litre, but a relatively sensible volume. So we would usually recommend between 500 millilitres and 700 millilitres before the event, in the couple of hours before the event. Helps you to absorb and retain as much of that fluid and sodium as possible without making it slosh around in your stomach, or without making you feel like you need to pee it out. So that would be the place to start, and not just pounding lots and lots of extra water, because that can be counterproductive.
All right, perfect. The next question is from Pat. I don't have his location, but he writes, I never seem to need to drink much fluid on the bike or when running. I approximately drink 500 milliliters of a carbohydrate drink every 2 hours, and I very rarely have anything other than clear pee. If I try to drink 500 milliliters per 1 hour, as often recommended, I end up peeing all day. I pee quite regularly anyway, about once every couple of hours on any given normal day. Is there any benefit to me forcing more fluid down per hour when training or racing?
I would say this is probably a fairly short and sweet answer to Pat's question, which is that no. If what he's doing works for him, that's a relatively small amount of fluid consumption for an endurance athlete per hour, 250 milliliters in my experience, but it's not unheard of. And if he doesn't say specifically, but you'd expect Pat to be someone with a relatively low sweat rate. If he doesn't require, or doesn't seem to require, as much fluid as the average, or as what other people recommend, then he should stick with what he knows. If it's working for him, I think it's all good.
All right. And the next question is from Michael Lieberson, past guest of the show in Canada, who asks about sport drink osmolality, whether it's important, and what to consider when selecting a sports drink, or how to consider osmolality when selecting it. And he goes on to write about how he's heard people recommending that the key role of fluids ingested may be to replace fluids lost rather than act as a vehicle for carbs and electrolytes, and therefore having an isotonic or slightly hypotonic solution in these fluids might be the best from that perspective because of better fluid absorption. That would be the theory anyway, and the theory also would be that a hypertonic solution would draw fluid into the gut, which would cause GI distress potentially, and also not being as effective at hydrating the athlete. So what's your take on this? What do we know about osmolality? And go on and explain osmolality as well for those that are not familiar with it.
Yeah, for sure. We can start with that. I mean, osmolality really, in very simple terms, is the amount of solute, or the amount of stuff that's dissolved into a solution. So the more stuff you put into a drink bottle other than water, the higher the osmolality goes. And it's important because the osmolality of the relationship between the osmolality of the fluid that you're drinking and the osmolality of your blood dictates to a certain extent how effective that drink will be at delivering fluids, electrolytes, and carbohydrates into your system when you're sweating and working. And really, you can split sports drinks into three broad categories. You've got hypertonic sports drinks that are very heavy on nutrients or calories or whatever. They've got a lot of solute in them, and they would typically be the kind of things that are very, very good at delivering energy quickly. Because if you put quite a lot of carbohydrate into a sports drink, obviously you get a high calorie count in it, and it delivers lots of calories, but they're less effective at rehydration. So the example I often use for people that would understand a hypertonic drink that athletes use all the time would be flat Coca-Cola. It's about 10 or 12% carbohydrate. People drink it when they're feeling low on blood sugar normally, and it's very effective at getting energy back in the system. But as he points out, because it's a very high level of osmolality, it's less effective at purely from a rehydration point of view. Then if you step down in osmolality, you get to isotonic drinks, and isotonic drinks are supposed to be a very similar osmolality to blood. So these were the typical drinks in this category are the classic sports drinks like Gatorade and Lucozade and Powerade, the ones which contain a little bit of carbohydrate, so a 6-7% carbohydrate solution, a little bit of electrolytes, and obviously lots of water. And these, I like to call these the jack of all trade sports drinks. So these were originally designed to replace some energy, some electrolytes, and some fluids, and are actually good for athletes who are maybe doing short and fast or intermittent sports where they don't have particularly high requirements for hydration specifically or energy specifically, but a little bit of a top up when they're doing what they're doing is useful. These can go a little bit wrong though for endurance athletes who are doing long hot races in the heat, because if you try to get all of your fluid needs from what is a relatively syrupy carbohydrate mix, it can cause those GI issues and make you feel a bit sick after a while, make you feel bloated and nauseous. On the lower end, the hypotonic.
And can I interject there? Why is that? If they are isotonic, why do these drinks still bloat you and make you feel sick potentially?
I think it's because it's for two reasons. One, it's if you drink a very large volume of them to compensate for high sweat losses. There was an interesting study in Sweden or Switzerland, actually, sorry, I think a few years ago, where they took a load of commercially available isotonic sports drinks, either powders or pre-mixed drinks, and mixed them up and measured the actual osmolality of them. And most of them were, in fact, slightly hypertonic and not actually isotonic. So they tend to be a little bit thicker than they need to be anyway. That's a sort of quirk of product labeling, because I think in order to classify a drink as isotonic, it technically doesn't have to be fully isotonic. so they can stray into being a little bit strong. And just consuming a large volume of them, they contain a hell of a lot of sugar, and that is fundamentally what kind of bungs up your gut after a while, because you can't absorb it fast enough in order to as fast as it's going in, it's not being absorbed. It's backing up in your gut and making you feel a bit sicky. It's why a lot of people will find that watering down an isotonic sports drink, like basically putting 50% more water in them, makes them more palatable in hotter and longer events.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then I think you were about to go on to hypotonic drinks.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. So hypotonic drinks are basically they have the least amount of solute. And the reason that these are often the primary recommendation for longer and hotter endurance events is because when in those events, the primary role of what's in your drink bottle is to rehydrate you, not necessarily to give you energy. They might give you some energy. So a good hypertonic drink either has a very small amount of carbohydrates, so 2 or 3% carbohydrate mix, or even some of them, like the tablets, the effervescent tablets and whatnot, have no calories, but they have relatively high amounts of electrolytes to replace what you're losing in your sweat. Because some people say, you can just water down an isotonic drink to make it hypotonic, which is very true, but then you're also watering down a small amount of electrolytes into a minuscule amount. So a good hypotonic sports drink tends to have a little bit of carb or no carbohydrate, and then quite a lot of electrolytes, and then that optimizes the absorption in the gut and hydrates you a lot better than just either just drinking plain water or drinking something with a lot more calories in it. The downside of those is obviously, to an extent, you've got to eat more calories if your energy demands are quite high, but that tends to be the strategy that we see work most successfully with a lot of athletes once they get experienced at doing long distance stuff.
And why do you think that it works to eat more calories? Because that would be like a gel would be very hypertonic, but why does that still work when your drink is hypotonic?
I think a lot of it's because the more solid a food, and gels are always an interesting one, and some people get on well with them, some people don't. I think when we talk about more solid food, it certainly forms a bolus in your stomach and then gets digested more slowly. I'm not sure on the exact rate of absorption with absorbing gels versus liquids, but I know that from practical experience that the longer and slower events get, the more athletes seem to thrive on a combination of hypotonic drinks and solid foods. As events sort of get towards the shorter and faster end, but are still maybe going on for several hours, athletes will tend to some athletes at least will tend to gravitate more towards, say, hypotonic drinks and gels and get on okay with that. But I think a lot of it comes down to personal preference, personal ability to tolerate what you're putting in, and potentially also some practice and training, because there's a lot of evidence nowadays that the gut is relatively trainable, and if you start to experiment and try different types of food and drink and gel combinations in training and get the body used to them, you can sometimes get better results.
Yeah, I actually have an episode on training the gut that I'll link to in the show notes, and if you have something on your blog, then we can link to that as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
Just one thing here that Michael asked in the question is that so he mentioned Stacey Sims, who's also a past guest on the show, and the guys at Scratch, and that they argue that the key role of fluids ingested is to replace fluids lost rather than as a vehicle for carbs and electrolytes. So even the electrolyte importance there is sort of minimized compared to the fluid replacement. What's your take on that statement?
I think that it's still the role of electrolyte replacement in fluid balance for athletes is still contested and is still fairly open to debate in a lot of people's eyes. I think that it's because the reason for that is not because there's a right or a wrong answer. It's not that we don't need to take electrolytes when we're racing, or we need to take lots of them. It's that we need to be aiming to replace them in proportion, or at least approximate proportion to losses, because at some point electrolyte depletion or sodium loss becomes a problem for the body. we know a lot from the world of medicine and from the world of sports science to suggest that if you add sodium in with drinks, then you can maintain much better blood volume than if you just drink water alone or if you just drink a carb solution. So the idea of replacing fluids when we're sweating heavily for many hours is ultimately to maintain blood volume. Blood's very salty, and therefore it makes a lot of sense to have an element of electrolytes in there. I think that the disagreement comes from the fact that, some people's requirements are very high, some people's requirements are negligible, and therefore, there's just not enough research been done on the individualization of this to come up with strong guidelines yet.
But even if electrolytes had no importance whatsoever for a particular individual with low electrolyte needs, then having electrolytes in the fluid will, as you mentioned, then help with better fluid absorption because of
if you get the mixture about right. We talk about having these kind of three levers to pull when it comes to your nutrition program, because basically your body, when you're exercising for a prolonged period, needs calories, it needs water, and it needs some salt. And the proportion of those varies based on your output. It varies on the temperature. It varies a lot from person to person. So basically, having a handle on what kind of level of calories you can absorb and utilize, the amount of fluid that you might be losing or that you can absorb, and also whether you are a kind of low, medium or high salt loss person. If you have an understanding of those basic three variables, you can then tweak them in training and in practice and in competition to find out what the best ratio for you is. I learned in my racing career that my requirements for particularly for salt and fluid were very high compared with other people, but I could race for fairly long distances on quite a low to minimal carbohydrate intake. So I always had to skew my intake a bit more heavily towards a hydration focus than calories. Other people seem to be the other way around, and it just requires a little sort of playing with those three individual levers to find out the best ratio for you.
Yeah, perfect. I think we covered that question. So let's move on to the next one, which is from Brent in Houston, Texas. And he writes that my question has to do with proper hydration for children and younger teenagers. They do triathlons that range from short distances that might last 20 minutes to an hour or so. And the question here is, do you have any recommendations for hydration strategies for these younger teenagers or ages 11 to 15 for these longer races that last up to an hour?
Yeah, I think it's always an interesting one, making recommendations for kids. I'm a dad of two kids myself, and I'm quite fascinated by their what they eat and drink, because their kids are generally actually really quite good at being intuitive about what they need. There'll be days when my little boy doesn't seem to drink much at all, and then another day he'll be drinking loads and loads. And it's all, they don't overthink it. They just respond to their instincts. And I think that while kids are, especially while they're doing, although up to an hour in the Texas heat is a considerable amount of exercise, while kids are growing and developing and playing at sport like this, trying to over-educate them on these things is largely unnecessary and probably could even be counterproductive. I would say the principal thing with kids is just making sure they've got drinks available, and usually water, making sure they've got access to them in an easy way, and letting them sort themselves out, by listening to their instincts. If they're thirsty, they will definitely drink. If they're not thirsty, they won't, and they should be left to a large extent to their own devices, unless past experience with certain individuals shows anything different. I think that there might be some things you could do in terms of informing good practice, like encouraging kids, if they might not be aware that they're doing something strenuous later in the day, and that they should potentially drink a little bit more in the build up to that. And so it might be good to encourage them to do some extra drinking before, and make sure they've got drinks available during and after something quite strenuous. But I'm not a big fan of treating kids like mini adults in that regard. I think that they should learn to trust their bodies and go with their instincts quite a lot.
Yeah, and for like a 1 hour race, potentially the thermoregulation of the core temperature might be more critical than the hydration. So it's actually just pouring some water over you when you're running or training, whether you're a kid or an adult for those shorter races. That's at least for me. I would rather take 2 mugs of water at the aid station and pour both of them over me and keep myself cool rather than drink it, because if I have preloaded with hydration before the race. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think I agree. There's definitely evidence to suggest that even if it doesn't massively impact performance, it can really impact your rating of perceived exertion and how you feel. So you'll see it in the Tour, the Tour de France is on at the moment, and you'll see on the mountain climbs that spectators will often, sometimes give the riders drinks, and the riders obviously don't drink them because they don't know for sure what's in them. But if they get given water, they'll dump it over their heads rather than chuck it away because they know it helps them cool down. And so dumping water on your head is a very smart strategy in shorter, faster events where, core body temperature is an issue.
Yeah. All right. And next question is from Dom in Luxembourg. And his question is, doing a long distance triathlon, I use precision hydration products, the pH 1500. The question is, should all my fluid be precision hydration mix with, or should... Wait, I'm trying to make sense of this question. My other fluid is my gels dissolved in water and is essentially my fuel. And if all fluids should be precision hydration, or even half being only precision hydration and the other being pure water, what is the easiest way to carry the powder to mix it on the course with the supplied water? Would it be tabs or the sachets, or what would you recommend? So let's cover that.
For a start, I think that I would not usually recommend that athletes drink exclusively one thing during competition. If I'm doing a race, a long race especially, I actually I'll use the pH 1500 myself because I lose a lot of salt in my sweat. But I'll always have a bottle of water available as well, because as you get deeper into the race, your taste buds start to tell you whether you want something which is a little bit salty, which might indicate that you need to replace some more, or whether you just feel like drinking plain water. So I would say for sure it's not a one. You don't need to exclusively use any one individual product the whole way through a race. It's probably smart to mix it up with some some water, or even other products that you pick up on course, because that, especially in a really long race, that flavor fatigue can be quite off-putting after a while. With regards to mixing drinks up though en route, again, I know that some athletes do that. I'm not particularly a big fan of it. What we recommend, we have a product which is like a capsule product called sweat salts that are in a blister pack. They've got 250 milligrams of sodium in them. And I always recommend to athletes, if you start off on your bike in a long race in a long Ironman, for instance, with the bottles full of your preferred drink mix, once you start running out of that, you can pick up plain bottles of water from the aid station and then supplement them for electrolytes with the sweat salt capsules. And you just take an appropriate ratio. So in terms of, if you were trying to get around 1500 milligrams a litre, you'd take 3 sweat salt capsules for every half litre of water that you drank, or thereabouts. And that to me feels like a bit more of an efficient way of doing it, rather than trying to carry products and mix them up as you're going around, which can be obviously tricky and is certainly going to slow you down.
Yeah, I would agree with that. That's also how I do it. And one thing that I might add is that having water in some of your bottles, or using water at least, is a great safety net. If you, for example, perhaps you drink a bit too much of your gel mixture, so you might start to feel bloated at some point, or for whatever reason, maybe it's unusually hot. So whatever rate of energy consumption that has worked for you in training doesn't work in racing, and you start to feel that you overdid it. And now at this point, then having some water might ease that bloating and that feeling of getting sick. So I think it's good to have water as a safety net as well.
Agreed.
So the next question is from in Switzerland, I believe, and her question is regarding gastric discomfort on the run. She has completed 3 Ironmans as an age group amateur in the female 55 to 59 category. Her first Ironman was in 2017, and she recently completed Nice in this year. She has used precision hydration all the time, except for during the events during the events, she actually supplements with what is offered once the supplies are finished. So a bit like we just talked about.
Yeah.
And let's see here. She stopped pretty often on the run during the first year with some cramps, but they did not stop her from continuing. Last year in her Ironman, from 15 kilometers into the run, she had very severe cramps and was forced to almost walk to the finish. And she thought that she had set off a bit too hard on the run from T2, as she felt great off the bike, but perhaps it was also a training issue. This year, however, in Nice, she was very careful and didn't eat that much on the bike, was very modest with the power output on the bike, and that the heart rate was in control, quite low for her. She felt strong off the bike and into the run, and forcing herself to go slow on the run, but then suffered cramps again at 15 kilometers into the run, and also nausea and needing to poop. She was able to finish the run by going very slowly, around 7 minutes per kilometer, instead of 5:30 to 5:45 pace, and stuck to Coke on the run, which felt okay. She also had precision hydration salt tabs with a sip of water. So what would your recommendation be here to solve these cramping issues that seem to trouble Meg in her Ironman races?
Yeah, so it sounds like a tricky one, because it would be useful to also know what kind of stuff she is eating and what kind of how much volume of drinks she was consuming off the course and that sort of thing. I mean there's a lot going on in there, but the bottom line seems to be that the something in her, sounds like more in her nutrition and hydration strategy rather than her pacing, is derailing these races for her, and it would require a little bit of elimination, or going through a bit of a process of elimination to find out whether she's either taking too much of some things or not enough of others. And that's where I kind of would go back to that 3 levers analogy, and we would want to understand a bit more about how much fluid is Meg likely to need, how much salt, and how many calories, and then really simplify it down so that she's able to then manipulate those variables in some longer and harder training sessions, and maybe some B races, to try different strategies with, more or less fluid, more or less salt, more or less carbohydrate energy in different forms, to see whether any of that has a positive effect. Because unpicking what's going on with a nutritional strategy that's failing can be quite tricky, and sometimes you're almost best drawing a clean slate and starting again with like I say, playing around with those 3 variables.
Yeah, so test one at a time in training and some B races, and see what starts working. Do you think, is there ever a case of like, this is an Ironman and you're never going to do a complete Ironman in training? Like, to what extent does that impact on how you should test this? I mean, potentially you could actually go out and do a 180 kilometer ride and then just try running for, I don't know, 10 kilometers off it. And maybe you might be able to see from that sort of really long training day, but still not a full Ironman, what is causing this, if you use your race hydration and nutrition on the bike. Do you have any thoughts on that? Like how you sort of simulate the Ironman race without being able to do the full distance in training?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because it's a perennial problem for people doing Ironman. It's like, how many times are you going to actually put your body through that per year? You can't do a full Ironman productively, I don't think, in training, just to shake out your nutrition strategy, because it's going to leave you pretty broken and tired and not able to keep your training volume up. So when I was racing, the sessions that I focused on attempting to test things like nutrition and hydration plans were ones where I would probably go something like half to 2/3 of the race distance, bike and run, neglecting to do the swim first, with the end of the bike and a good proportion of the run at around target race pace. So that might be something like 100, 120k, 100k ride, and a 25k run with large elements of race pace thrown in there, and ideally simulating other things that are relevant on race day, the position on your race bike, a similar type of profile of the course, similar weather conditions, if you're lucky enough to be able to replicate some of those to the best of your ability. And that's that's probably as good and accurate a test as you can get for then implementing your race day nutrition plan without having to do it in a race.
Yeah, I was going to say that you mentioned race pace there, and that's actually something that can be quite important if she hasn't really tried her plan in at actual race pace. It has been working well in long, fairly steady endurance pace, but maybe not at quite even though the bike seems to have been a fairly easy one, but maybe running is faster than she would have done her long brick runs in training. So that might make a difference as well if she hasn't actually trained the nutrition and hydration plan at that intensity that she's racing at.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think the intensity thing is really key, because a lot of people do, say that they're going to test out their products. I'll test them out on a really long bike ride, or I'll go out, go for 6 hours and do this. But if it isn't at that specific intensity, that really hard intensity that you'll be racing at, then and if it's not if it's not in the aero position on the bike and all those factors that can influence digestion, blood flow to the gut, that kind of thing, then you're not giving it a fair test. And so making sure, I would rather see someone do a moderate duration but race pace test of what they're doing rather than do a long duration, low intensity effort to test the nutrition plan.
All right. Yeah. So let's move on to the next one, which is from Kathy in Memphis, who asks hi Andy, I love my long distance events, but collapsed during an ultra in extreme heat and ended up on a drip in a hospital last year. A friend recommended the book Waterlogged by Tim Noakes. Having read the book, I wonder if I was overdoing it with my hydration strategy and not listening to my body. Where do you stand on this drink to first tactic that Tim Noakes advocates?
Yeah, that is a good question, because the book Waterlogged definitely shook up the kind of sports science, sports nutrition world a few years ago. And the basic premise of the book from Tim Noakes, because Tim Noakes was the doctor and the researcher who was behind really uncovering the growing incidence of hyponatremia in sport, where athletes have actually got into a lot of trouble, and some athletes have died, in fact, from over drinking and diluting their body sodium levels. And he sort of pins the blame in the book on the sports drink industry for advocating a more is better approach to hydration, whereas 100 years ago, or even less than that, we used to recommend, or athletes were recommended, not to drink very much. Nowadays, or certainly in the 1990s and around then, it was very common for coaches and sports scientists to recommend athletes should drink a lot. And then ultimately this led to this sort of epidemic of hyponatremia. Now, Kathy doesn't say for sure whether she got hyponatremia, but if she intimates she might have been overdoing it with the drinking. And I would definitely say that certainly in longer events, an element of drinking to thirst is really important, or listening to your body, because you don't just want to keep piling fluids in when you're not feeling like you're needing them or absorbing them. The actual view that Noakes takes in his book is quite extreme, in that he advocates only drinking to thirst and only drinking water, which based on experience I've had with other athletes, is also probably not an adequate enough plan. So I prefer a blended approach where you have a hydration strategy or an outline plan that you're going to follow based on some trial and error and some research you've done on your own body. But then on the day, you also do rely to an extent on instincts and thirst, because that helps to prevent you from overdoing it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think it's analogous to how you would go about like pacing in a race, that you wouldn't go into a long distance, or for most age groupers anyway, you wouldn't go into a long distance race, especially without having any sort of idea of what your sustainable pace or intensity might be. But then equally, you wouldn't go in and saying that I'm going to hold 197.5 watts on the bike or something like that. Yeah. You would have sort of a range, and then move within that range that would be possible and sustainable depending on how you feel on the day.
Yeah, I think it's a perfect analogy. It's a case of having guardrails to work within, but not treating them as a hard and fast rule, basically.
Yeah. All right. Next question is from Devon in Texas, who asks, I hear sodium mentioned a lot when it comes to hydration, but what about the other electrolytes like potassium and magnesium? Are these important ingredients to look for in a sports drink?
Yeah. So the reason sodium is mentioned a lot from a hydration perspective is because your sweat comes from extracellular fluid in the body, and the predominant electrolyte in extracellular fluid is sodium. So it's the one we see the largest amounts of in sweat. I think sodium accounts for about 90% of the electrolyte component of most people's sweat. So potassium is an important electrolyte in the body, as is magnesium, but potassium is the predominant intracellular electrolyte. So although we need to replace some of it because we do lose small amounts in sweat, predominantly that comes from the diet. So most sports drinks, if they're composed well, will have a high proportion of sodium and might have a small proportion of things like calcium, magnesium, and potassium. And the evidence behind the replenishment of those to replace what's lost in sweat is weak, but there also seems to be little downside to replacing some of them as well. So I think that's why they end up on the ingredient list of most sports drinks.
Okay. And then we have Steve from Richmond who asks, I'm a 50-something triathlete and my own performances have inevitably declined with age, which is something I'd imagine a fair few of your listeners can relate to. With age, I find myself having to answer the call of nature more often nowadays, and it got me thinking about how much I drink when I train and race. Should I be changing how much fluids I take on as I get older? So there we go. How should hydration change with age?
The evidence around what happens as we get older is that hydration is a bit more of a challenge because of a few reasons. Firstly, thirst instinct is blunted a little bit as you age. So maybe if you are relying on instincts, then they're less trustworthy. So it might be easier to start to become dehydrated before you know to correct it. At the same time, like Steve said, you can get a weaker bladder, which means you pee more, which leads to losing more fluid. And also, as you get older, you tend to lose muscle mass, and in your muscle cells is where your body stores a lot of water. So you've kind of got less of a reservoir of water on board when you start. So all of that means that hydration can be a bit more challenging as you get older. What we usually recommend for athletes in that scenario is maybe using a slightly stronger electrolyte drink when they are racing and training, especially if they're sweating a lot, because that will help them to absorb and retain more of what they drink, and also paying particular attention to preloading before exercise, so they're starting really well topped up. So we've actually got a blog on older athletes and hydration needs, which we can link to go into that in more detail.
Yeah, and that's interesting with how your perception of first changes as you age, and that I guess is another reason that the complete drink to first argument isn't necessarily the best one. All right, we have Raj from Leicester who asks, I recently did my first Ironman 7.3 and I got terrible cramps on the bike at about 70 kilometers, to the point where when I jumped off the bike to start running, my upper legs were locking with severe cramp. I take salt tablets and tend to take 3 salt tabs on the bike, but this is the second time on a longer distance ride that I've had these problems. I just don't get them when training, and I have been training very hard and rode right on point speed-wise for the race. Could this be hydration related?
Yeah, the cramps, as we've discussed at length before, cramps is such a tricky one to diagnose. We know that there's lots of different reasons why cramps can happen. The electrolyte dehydration theory of muscle cramping is not strongly supported by lots and lots of really great scientific evidence, but it has masses of anecdotal and circumstantial evidence behind it. And so it's often a good place to start looking if cramps are happening later on in endurance events and trying things out, because the downside of trying to manipulate your hydration plan to see if it helps is relatively small, and the upside can be massive. When he says he's taking 3 salt tablets on the bike, if that's 3 salt tablets across the whole of a 70.3 bike ride, and that's but if he doesn't specifically say, but if that's all of the electrolytes he's taking in, then that's a relatively small dose. And that's what we sometimes see with people who say, oh, well, I've been getting cramps and I've tried taking electrolytes, but they don't seem to help. And then what you have to look at is the dose. Now, a typical electrolyte, a typical salt tablet might have 150, 200 milligrams of sodium in it. So if it was on the upper end, that's 200. He might be taking 600 milligrams of sodium over, let's say, 2 to 3 hours on a middle distance triathlon. That's really quite a small amount. So one place we'd start to look with a case like this is, okay, what happens if we tweak up the amount of sodium and fluid that he's able to consume on the bike? Does that play a role? The other place to go looking in this scenario is intensity, because we know that when you ask muscles to do things they're not brilliantly trained to do, they can complain and cramp as a result. So making sure that he's done enough, race intensity rides on his race bike, that kind of thing is also going to be important to try and rule out fatigue as a primary cause of the cramps.
Yeah, regarding that dosage, if they are 200 milligrams salt tabs that he's taking and he's getting 600 milligrams of sodium for the 7.3 bike, and that would be, let's call it 3 hours, then that's only 200 milligrams per hour, when potentially, as we discussed before, the range of how much electrolytes you need might be, he could be like somebody who needs 1500 milligrams. So he's getting almost as little as a tenth, a bit more than his requirement. So yeah, there's definitely room to experiment with more electrolytes, more sodium there.
Yeah, for sure. Exactly. That's a good point.
Okay, so next we have Corey from Boulder, who asks, I usually drink a carb-rich energy drink mix on the bike during half and full Ironman events, but I want to get more electrolytes in to set me up for a good run leg, as my next race is a hot and humid one. Can I just mix salt tabs in with this energy powder mix, so it's all in one bottle?
Yeah, we get asked questions like this a lot about people seem to love the idea of, for whatever reason, of combining all their nutrition and hydration and electrolyte needs and everything into these homebrew one bottle mixes of stuff. And generally, I try to advocate against it, partly because of this, like we talked about in one of the early questions, osmolality. The more stuff you dump into a bottle, the higher the osmolality gets, and the more challenging it becomes for your stomach to deal with it and your gut to deal with it. The other reason as well is that those three levers, the calories, the water, and the salts, in my opinion, you want to be able to pull those levers independent of each other. So if you are, suddenly, if Corey feels like he's getting low on energy and needs more carbohydrates, if his main source of carbohydrate is what's in his drink bottle and it's got extra salts in there and it's all of his fluids, then he's just going to have to drink way more, and then you can potentially run into the stomach issues thing. So whilst it's not, I would never say, people do some very specific things with nutrition plans like this and find that they work for them. And if they do, that's absolutely fine. Performance is always, the best test in my view. But if we're approaching this from a theoretical point of view, I'd be saying to Corey, how about, try taking some salt tabs with as an additional, so washing them down with your drinks, and then at least you can dial up and dial down the amount you're taking per hour based on how you feel. It seems like a more flexible approach.
Yeah, that makes sense. And also that brings a question to my mind that I want to ask, that actually I thought of when we were discussing osmolality earlier. And that's these new energy mixes that we see from, for example, the Martin, like really highly concentrated carbohydrate mixes. Do you have experience with those from yourself or from athletes that you've talked with about them, and how do they work, and how do they potentially fit into a race plan?
Yeah, well, things like the Morton ones are like a hydrogel, where they start off as a liquid in the bottle, and then with the stomach acid, they combine into a gel so that you can allegedly absorb more carbohydrate via the drink per hour or per serving without causing GI distress. I think that the sort of scientific evidence behind them isn't really there yet. There have been some studies published, I think a couple of studies at least, one of which was fairly positive, one which was inconclusive, about how much carbohydrate they make available in the bloodstream and whether that can be utilized. So on a practical note, I've had a play around with them myself. I've found that I was surprised at how palatable they were compared with how I thought they would be, given the high concentrations of carbohydrate. And I found it very hard to make a strong judgment on whether they were any better or worse than having a drink and taking a gel, other than with the convenience factor of it all being in one bottle. So I think that the jury's out on them. They're certainly being used by a lot of athletes, and there's some good performances linked to them. But whether you can attribute the performances to those specific products is a lot less clear.
Yeah. Okay. Then we have Miriam from Bordeaux, France, who asks, I read somewhere that you can prehydrate before a race. How many days before a race should I do that? And what should I drink?
Yeah, again, I think we touched on this one earlier, but the classic thing that I used to do as an athlete, and I've seen so many athletes do and continue to do to this day, is get worried, especially if an event is a big one or it's going to be a hot race. Then athletes feel the need to start drinking way too much in the days building up, and actually this can be quite negative, because all it does is cause you to pee more, because your body equalizes the amount of fluid that it's got on board and keeps things level by making you go to the toilet. So we would generally suggest, what you obviously don't want to do before a race is go into it dehydrated. So making sure that you've got just a normal, adequate level of fluid consumption in the days leading up is good common sense. And then we recommend starting to prehydrate only the night before and the morning of the race, because if you take on much additional fluid before that, then you're going to end up peeing it out. So usually we recommend a strong electrolyte drink, something like the pH 1500, around about 500 millilitres the night before, another 500 or 600 millilitres the morning of the race, about an hour or 90 minutes before, so that you can absorb it, pee out any extra, and then hit the line in good shape.
Yeah, that's what I do as well personally, and for me, it seems to be a protocol that works. Then we have the penultimate question here. We have two left. So this is John from Dublin, who asks, what's the biggest mistake that athletes make when it comes to hydration on race day? I feel like I've made my fair share of mistakes during the course of my racing career, whether it's dropping cups at aid stations, forgetting to fill my bottles up on the ride, or heading out on a long training ride without any money or anything to eat. What do you think?
Or hydration mistakes on race day, I would say, kind of fall into two extreme categories. One would be following an overly rigid plan despite what their body's telling them. So and that often can lead to overconsumption. I was certainly guilty of that when I was racing, in that when it was hot, I would start off with an idea to consume, let's say, for instance, one bottle, 750 ml bottle per hour. If I felt like then my performance was declining, I might even take that up to 1,000 milliliters an hour. But then I would then stick with that rigidly, even if I was getting bloated and my stomach was filling up or whatever. So sticking with an overly rigid plan is not a helpful idea. On the flip side, though, if you go into a race with absolutely no plan and are just going to wing it, that can be just as disastrous. So it's basically the extreme ends of planning. It's like not planning enough and just winging it, or sticking to an overly rigid plan. The best athletes, the best performances tend to come from, like we talked about with pacing and other things, from an idea, and working within some guardrails that you've worked out, but then listening to your body on the day and adapting it as you go in order to get the best out of yourself.
Yeah. And what about training? Because he mentions as well, like going out on a long training ride without any money or anything to eat. So if we expand this question to apply to training as well, is there anything else other than having a plan for training that comes to mind? Any mistakes?
I think a lot of it comes down to being organised. We're all guilty of it to an extent, but one of the biggest things with training is, I think more athletes are more inclined to show up less well prepared. you're never going to be as well prepared as you are for every race where you've tapered and ticked all the boxes. But at the same time, if you're training in the evening, neglecting to drink properly or adequately during the day and thinking, oh, I'll just, stick a bottle on the bike when I go and that'll make up for it is kind of a counterproductive attitude. It's about just, being organised, preparing in advance, and making sure that when you show up to a session, you're well hydrated. And if you're someone who's training really hard and maybe doing 2-a-day sessions, it's about making sure your recovery from a hydration standpoint after the session is also on point.
And finally, we have Pete from Halifax who writes, I'm training for my first Ironman 7.3 and I'm still trying to get a handle on what to eat and drink during the race. A lady in my training group reckons she went a whole season using just coconut water to fuel her races. Is this something that you'd recommend? I'm not entirely convinced coconut water alone offers enough to sustain me, although she swears by it.
Yeah, that's quite an extreme strategy, I would say. If it works for her, that's all good. But I wouldn't anything which is oversimplified and quite extreme, I would always be wary of when it comes to nutrition and hydration advice. I probably sound like I'm horribly repeating myself, but this thing for me of just getting it in athletes' heads that you need these, basically you need these three things when you're racing. You're going to need some water, you're going to need some calories, and you're going to potentially need some salts or electrolytes. And figuring out the ratio and recipe of those that you need given your individual outputs and the length of the race and the environment is the key thing to do. Coconut water is often, I quite like drinking coconut water, but it's been marketed as a sports drink to a lot of people, but the composition is really odd for a sports drink. It's really high in potassium and really low in sodium, so it kind of makes no sense for replacing sweat losses. It does have a little bit of sugar in it, but it's I wouldn't know actually off the top of my head how much, but I think from having drunk it myself, I would suspect it's quite low on calories, so it's unlikely to give you a huge amount of carbohydrates to sustain you. So really splitting those three things out and starting to figure out, okay, how many calories do I think I might need per hour? The typical range for most guys is going to be somewhere between 50 and 80 grams of carbohydrate per hour is a good starting point to play around with. How much fluid? Well, kind of 500 to 750 milliliters an hour in normal, not too extreme conditions is a good idea. And then the sodium side of things, it could be anywhere from a couple of hundred to 1200, 1500 milligrams of sodium per hour. They're the kind of three variables, and then figuring out what kind of nutritional products or foods or drinks can help you meet those numbers, and trying it out is going to be the best place to start. I think going for an extreme, I'm only going to use X, Y, or Z strategy is
I think so, and it goes well beyond hydration and even beyond nutrition. I think with training in general, like extreme things. Sure, if it works for somebody, all power to them. But in general, extreme recipes of whatever is not something that is the recommendation for the person next to that person following the extreme approach.
No, we see it, don't we? And in nutrition is a great field for it, where you see, the kind of the really extreme ketogenic diets, or just eating meat diet, or in equipment, it could be the running barefoot versus running in cushioned shoes argument. People get quite dogmatic about really extreme views, and then they pull out extreme examples of where something has worked or is perceived to have worked for an individual, and it kind of gets extrapolated out as proof that this must therefore be the answer, when actually it's a lot more nuanced and a lot more individual, and often a lot less simple to implement. Actually, those kind of really dogmatic and crazy sounding recommendations, the appeal of them is it makes things very simple. Oh, I just have to drink coconut water and I'll be fine. That's the main appeal to that, I guess, to people, is it's very simplistic. You can't really get that wrong. But if it doesn't work for you, then is it
And I also think it's the appeal of something that perhaps is less used. So then potentially it's like a silver bullet that can really move the needle for you. But if there was something like that, then it would be used and people would know about it. It wouldn't be extreme.
Exactly.
So one more follow-up question on that. You mentioned there 200 to 1500 milligrams of sodium per hour, but often the units we use are also per liter of fluid. So how much sodium you would put in the bottle, for example. So is the units, how would you like use these different units? Like what would be your recommendation for how to use sodium? Would you generally stick to the per hour recommendation or per liter, and then I guess how much you drink in general would dictate sort of how much sodium you take in?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Generally, I guess I prefer to talk in the per liter sort of range, because it's important that there's a ratio of sodium to fluid, because one of the dangers of, say, using salt tablets, for instance, is that you can increase the amount of milligrams of sodium you take quite dramatically, but if you don't also take adequate fluids in with it, then you end up with a mismatch of concentration in the gut, which can make you feel quite sick. Generally, if I'm talking about 200 to 1500 milligrams, you could say 200 to 1500 milligrams per liter, but then the absolute net amount of sodium will vary with the volume of fluid that you intake. So 1500 milligrams per liter would be towards the upper end of what I would consider to be, wise to use as a strong electrolyte mix for taking in during training and competition, whereas 200 milligrams is going to be on the very light and weak end, and therefore playing around with the amount that you drink at those specific ratios. If you think you're someone who's going to require a large amount of sodium, then taking a more concentrated solution is probably better than just randomly upping the raw amount of sodium that you take and then trying to guesstimate match the fluid to it.
Yeah, perfect. All right, that was all the questions covered. Thank you so much, Andy. It was really helpful. And as usual, I learned a lot. And I hope that the listeners, not just the ones sending in questions, but everybody has learned a lot as well. So to wrap up, what's going on with Precision Hydration? Any news that you want to talk about, or anything we should know about what you're up to?
Well, we're keeping pretty busy, that's for sure. The hotter part of the year in the Northern Hemisphere tends to do that for us at the moment. We've got in terms of sort of exciting stuff, we're in the early phases of it at the moment, but we are looking at new product developments at the moment. They're not going to be anything that we can announce in the next few months, but we're definitely looking at expanding the range of what we do from a product point of view, which is quite an exciting thing to be getting started with. We've grown our team at PHHQ now, and sort of related to this Q&A. If anyone's got questions, we've got now a full-time team who are answering athletes' questions on hydration, nutrition, and related subjects, and they can get a hold of James and the guys at hello@precisionhydration.com, the email address, or messages through any of our social media platforms, and we've got a team waiting to answer the kind of Q&As that we've had on the discussion today. So we'd love to hear from people on that.
And for the listeners that are interested in trying out your product, how can they get a hold of that?
I think the best way is through precisionhydration.com, through our website. If any of your listeners have not redeemed the code that we've got set up with you, which is all caps, that triathlon show, they can use that once to get a free sample of the Precision Hydration product. So you just put in that triathlon show in the coupon code, and it will give them a free item from our website. Over and above that, we've also got another code which is going to be valid for 1 month from when this podcast goes live, which is that triathlon show 20, which is 20 on the end, and that will give 20% off orders placed within that time frame. So if people have already had the free box and tried it and like it and they want to top up, they can use that triathlon show 20 and get 20% off.
Brilliant. Thank you so much again, and it was a pleasure as usual talking with you. And we'll have everything linked in the show notes so that people can find the blog posts and have a look at the coupon codes and everything. So that will all be on scientifictriathlon.com/TTS192, which will be this episode number.
192. You've been busy.
Yeah, definitely. And this doesn't include the Thursday episodes, which are numbered differently. It's just the Monday episodes.
Fantastic.
All right. Talk to you later, Andy.
Thanks a lot, Michael.
I hope you enjoyed that episode. As usual, you can find the show notes on thattriathlonshow.com or go directly to scientifictriathlon.com/TTS191. Do let me know if you like this episode format, a Q&A format with a particular topic and an expert guest to answer listener questions. I enjoyed doing it a lot, so I'll be very curious to hear your feedback on it as well. As mentioned, I'll link to all the previous appearances that Andy's made in the show notes and episode description. And we also have links to 5 precision hydration blog posts that are related to the questions we answered today. So you'll find them in the show notes and episode description as well. Finally, I want to keep reminding you that I really appreciate it if you can keep spreading the word about the podcast. Mention it to your club members, your racing frenemies, your coach, and anybody you think will find it useful. And also thank you for rating and reviewing. We are getting close to 500 global reviews in the iTunes and Apple Podcast Store. And I'd really like to hit that 500 benchmarks soon. So every review counts. We get just a handful per month, on average, maybe 10 or so. So yours really makes a big difference. One review that I want to read out loud here is from 462727472 in Great Britain, who writes, "Excellent podcast, 5 stars. I listen to a lot of endurance sports podcasts, and this is the best for translating all the info out there on triathlon training and racing into simple advice for the age group triathlete. Highly recommended." Thank you for that name. I won't read out your name again, but I really do appreciate it just as much as if you had a more normal username. It really makes a big difference, so thank you. And thank you, of course, to our sponsors, Precision Hydration. Again, those promo codes mentioned are That Triathlon Show, all one word, all caps, to get your first box or tube for free. And if you've already used that, you can use That Triathlon Show 20, or if you're making a bigger order, That Triathlon Show 20, and that's 20. That will get you 20% off your entire order on precisionhydration.com. And thank you to Roka, that you can find on roka.com, that's roka.com, and you can get 20% off your entire order with the promo code TTS, all caps. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.